Hey, welcome to Advanced Child Protection, Part 3. And this should be a little bit shorter than the other two, I hope. And it just is a continuation from Part 2 at the very end. Basically, I just cut that part off and started here on this. And so if you haven't seen Part 2 or don't remember the ending, then, this is just going to go right straight in. It'll be another part, and you won't be able to miss anything at all. So, yeah, and what this is basically is a period, a good portion of my life from about 1995 until 2007, or late 2006, when I was dealing with child molestation right here in my own house. My ex-wife had been diagnosed as a worst-case scenario manic depressive female child molester way back in '84, and it goes into all that and everything else in parts 1 and 2 of the Advanced Child Protection series, and also goes into it in the Bipolar Disorder for Spouses and What to Look For series. Pretty much when you're watching my videos, if you go back and look at my channel and you go from video to video to video that I've made, each one tells a little bit different part of the story as it continues on through time. This is the last right here today, and let's get started. And next thing you know, my wife starts going up and sleeping in my son's bed. And I'd already talked to my son, a long time before that at that time. And he knew not to go in his room when his mom was up there. And so I'm working a different job, still in the same place, but working to 6 to 2 hours now. And so I'm getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and leaving the house at, 5 o'clock. So I come out here to get ready to take my shower. It's 4:15 in the morning, and my son's sitting right here in his chair with his head all cocked over, sound asleep. So I wake him up, and I'm like, "What are you doing down here? How come you're not upstairs in your own bed?" And he's like, "Well, Mom's upstairs, and she's in my bed." And I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "Well, yeah, I didn't want to wake her, because she does have bipolar disorder. We want to let her get as much sleep as she possibly can, but now she's gone to his bed." Okay, and I'd never told them what was going on, really, with their mom at that time, And I was like, okay, I'll talk to her. It won't happen again. So the next day, I come home from work that afternoon, and I just talked to her, and I sit down and said, "Look, you need to not be sleeping in Abraham's bed. You need to not even be in his room, because you know what you are, And she's like, "I've never been to a psychiatrist in my life. I'm not a child molester. You're the ones with all the problems." And I'm like, "What do you mean I got the problems? You're the ones trying to sleep in our son's bed and taking his whole room away from him and not even letting him in there." And she's like, "Well, he's allowed in here." He goes, "No, he's not, because he knows from me that he's not allowed in his bedroom when you're in there. This has been enforced for years." Because my kids both know. Okay, now, I finally came out and told them what was going on. Well, I told my son. My daughter, I didn't feel I needed to know the whole thing because she was out of the house and she was safe. I'd separated her from my wife, and now she was on her own and doing her own thing, and she was doing fine. And my wife, she still has these 2 jobs that she'd gotten way back, a couple years before, because she kept saying I wasn't making enough money for her, because in that time I'd cut her off in the 2000 when she started spending the $4,000 to $6,000 a month. It was only $6,000 the one month, but it was, $4,000, $3,000, $2,500 at least. And so now she had to have 2 jobs, and I didn't know it was to support her $20,000 in credit card debt that she had. Because she wasn't telling me the truth. She was lying to me about everything and not telling me that she had 3 credit cards and her own post office box, so I didn't know that she was getting these bills somewhere else. She was hiding everything from me. Everything she possibly could. And now she's sleeping in my son's bed. And so I talked to her that day, and that was it. We were all done. And she wasn't sleeping in my bed. She was sleeping here on the couch, or my daughter still had a spare bed in her bedroom. We still had spare beds around. And I get up at 4:15 in the morning again, come back down, and here's my son sitting here again. Asleep, head all cocked to the side, you know, and he's already been going to the chiropractor and stuff for spinal problems and this and that, so I did not like seeing my son sitting here. So I was like, oh man, okay, I'll talk to your mom again. It won't happen again. Well, so I talked to her again. It didn't do any good. The very next morning I get up, I come down here, and here's my son sleeping here in my chair again. I'm like, okay, that's it. Third time's a charm. I've already talked to her, you know, the first time. I've already talked to her the second time. I'd already talked to her before that even, saying just stay out of his room. You know, give the guy his room. Give our son his own room. Let him be there in peace. Don't just go up there and take care of him. And she was taking care of him completely and totally, cleaning his room for him and everything all the time, and just babying him to just no degree. And she wouldn't even let him, you know, get a job because he didn't need to have a job because, you know, she was willing to do everything for him. And when I asked him to do dishes, she'd do the dishes and say that, oh no, he doesn't have to do dishes. I'll do them for him, trying to become his friend. Okay, you know, so here I was. I mean, I was pissed now. It was the third time I told her. You know, so I went ahead and I went upstairs and I walked over to the bed, and she was facing the other way, didn't know it was me. I think she thought it was Abraham at first. She got this huge smile on her face again, and you could see her with her eyes closed, and this huge smile. There was that excitement one more time that she thought her son was now going to get into bed with her. You know, but it wasn't her son this time, it was me. So I threw the covers off of her, and before I could tell her to get up, I looked down and realized that my wife was laying in my son's bed with no clothes on. Then I looked over to my left, and you didn't even realize my son wasn't there. He was still asleep out here. This is the other end of the house, in my chair out here. Because he just, when I saw him out here, I kind of didn't even say nothing to him. He woke up and said, hi, Dad. I was like, hey, how you doing, Abe? And he just turned right back and went right back out again. I mean, what a shock it was for me at that time. Here, my naked wife is upstairs. I mean, she has a see-through t-shirt on, one of my old wore-out t-shirts with holes in it everywhere. That's all she has on in our son's bed now. Okay, and this is the third day in a row. And I saw her clothes so neatly folded up on the nightstand of his that I was so shocked. I said, get out of bed and put your damn clothes on right now and come downstairs, we're going to talk. And she's like, no, I don't have to. I don't have to do anything you say. And she was completely and totally defiant of me. And this is what the psychiatrist said. He told me way back then, you have to be firm with her. You have to be completely and totally firm, which is why I said it the way I did in the first video, because when you're dealing with women who are molested as children because they've been beat down so hard when they were young, they won't listen to you unless you are very firm with them. So I looked at her again. I said, you get your ass out of that bed and get your clothes on right now, or I'm going to call the sheriff's office. And we're going to come up here and we're going to put you in shackles. And we're going to drag you out of this house butt naked in front of the kids, never to return. You know, and that's being pretty forceful. You know what I mean? I mean, when you got to go to that point to get your wife out of your son's bed, you know what we were going through here in this house. So she got up and got her clothes on. She came downstairs, and we had the school. And that's when I told Abraham. I said, look, Abraham, you know, your mom has some problems. Okay? She's not allowed to be in your bedroom anymore. Ever. When you're in there. If she wants to come up there and clean up for you while you're gone, that's okay. But while you're in there, that bedroom is yours. She's not going to take your bed away. She's not going to take your bedroom away from you ever again. Then we had the talk. I said, and if she does come up there, you tell her to get out. You tell her that Dad said you have to get out, and you know the rules of this household, and you're not allowed in my bedroom, And I told him, you do everything you have to, including kicking and screaming, to get her out of your bedroom. And, he's a good kid, He says, okay, Dad, no problem. And so she left. And I didn't see her the rest of the day. And I came home and, I picked up the kid from school, came home, and we did our own thing like we had been doing for a long time. It'd just been me and him, basically. And, he went up and went to bed. Next thing you know, I hear my wife come in the house, and start going upstairs to get in bed with him that night. And he did what he was told to do. As soon as she started coming up the stairs, I was like, Mom, you get out of here. You're not allowed in my room when I'm in here, Mom. And I can hear this because his bedroom's right above mine. I mean, this kid is so safe. It's not even funny. And I was right there just in tears down below listening to this, listening to my son have to throw his own mother out of his bedroom. Mom, get out of my room. No, Mom, you can't get into bed with me. No, Mom, no, Dad! And so there it was again, I got up, went down to the ladder, which is right, he had a ladder going up to his room right outside my bedroom door. And I said, Carol, get over here and get down here right now. You're not allowed to be in his room. You already agreed to this. You come down right now. And she said no. She's not coming down. She has every right to be up there and do whatever she wants to do. So I went out and I got the phone and I came back and I yelled upstairs. I said, Carol, come here and you look at this. And sister came over to the door and looked down at me, and I pressed 9 and 1 on the phone. And I said, I'm giving you to the count of 10 to come downstairs. And if you're not down here by then, I'm going to call the police. And I'm going to go ahead and press the charges of child molestation on you. And we're going to take you out of this house, never to return. And this was the most serious thing that I'd ever done. She said no. She wasn't going to come down. And started trying to argue with me, and I just said, 9, 8, 7. And she's up there just screaming at me why she's not coming down and how she has every right. And I got to 5, 4, 3, 2, and she came down the ladder. She packed her things and left. Because she had seen now that her son had turned against her. That he wasn't going to let her have her way. And in her own words were, God is telling me to do this. I can't follow God, and she's telling me that I'm Satan and that I'm just this terrible person because I'm keeping her from molesting our son and letting her follow God's plan. And that was pretty much it. She left. Spoke to me a few times here and there after that. I mean, she came back 2 weeks later. She'd already started letting me know that she wanted to divorce me. She'd been treating me like crap in front of our kids and in front of their friends for a long time. And now she wanted absolutely nothing to do with me whatsoever. And, but she wanted to look innocent in the eyes of the church. So she wanted me to see that I wanted to divorce her. So she just kept treating me bad and worse and worse and worse. She came home with bruises from other guys. She even had the gall to come home, 2 weeks later after that incident with just stuff dried in her hair. She had sperm dried in her hair and all over her. She didn't even, take a shower after she got done, committing adultery. And so yeah, this is worst case scenario, manic depressive, and that's the end of the story. That's the end of the child molestation, man. Make a long story short, she ended up divorcing me. Then she tried to take my son away from me, and I went ahead and went to the sheriff's office and told them the truth about what was going on here. And I told them the same story that you've heard now for pretty much since the very first series of Bipolar Disorder for Spouses, Part 1. And I ended up having to bring in Child Protective Services, and the state of California took our son away from her and gave her mandatory supervised visitation at her parents' house, while telling me that she would never call because she tried to molest him. And once a woman tries to molest her son and is caught, she won't speak to him again for years. And she didn't. She didn't speak to him for a long time. And she never called once, not even once, to go down and visit our son at her own parents' house for the next 3 years before he turned 18. You know, and he was on his own then. You know, I mean, he was still in his house, but he was on his own then. So, you know, that's how I dealt with child molesters. And my own wife right in his house, man, you know. And hopefully that everything I've told you gives you a complete and total view of what can happen to kids. The emotional way that their mothers try and set them up with other people, with other child molesters. And the same thing that child molesters do, like with Mickey. Convincing that 9-year-old that she was doing the right thing by having sex with him. You know, and I'm glad he went to prison. You know, I'm glad he did. I'm glad that Jared went to prison. I'm glad that John went to prison a number of times, and he's still in prison today. And that John, remember him from back in part 1 of this, when he was the one that molested her when she was 13. You know, and he's, ever since he was molested as a kid, he's been in and out of prison for molesting other women or other children. You know, it's a sad story, and this is my story, and you know, I know it's a terrible failure story, that I was a failure as a father, you know, for not seeing this. But, you know, when you're working against what I had to work with no knowledge of this whatsoever about how to deal with it, you know, I did my best. Was I really a failure as a father? Well, you know, in my own eyes, sometimes yes, I was, you know, because I didn't have the knowledge I needed to take care of what was going on, you know. But the thing is, I did my best, and I was there for my kids, and I'm still there for them today. Well, we got some more time here, so I want to go into what happened, you know, after she left. You know, and I already told you what was going on between us, and it was just, she was doing everything she possibly could to show me that she wanted a divorce. And so what I didn't realize is that she was going to church and sitting in the back and crying and crying and crying, you know, and pretending that, you know, I was abusing her and beating her and just treating her really bad. And that's what she was telling everybody, is that she was crying in the back of the church, saying, "No, he's abusing me, he's abusing me. You know, he's not letting me follow God's plan," and stuff like this. But she's not telling them when they go, "Well, what is he doing?" You know, and the pastor told me this afterwards, because he's the guy I went to anger management counseling with. He goes, "We pressed her, Reed, and you need to understand, we were dead set in putting you in jail." And I was like, "Really? Thank you." You know, I mean, if anybody was beating my wife, I'd want them to be put in jail, or me too, you know. So they didn't really know how to react to what I was saying to them, you know, because here he'd question my wife, you know, "Carol, what's he doing to you? All you have to do is tell me, and we'll go ahead and get the sheriff. We will go in there, we'll arrest him and put him in jail." And she'd just start breaking down and crying to them, "He's abusing me," and just go off and crying and crying and crying, and then she slammed the phone down and hang up on him in tears. So, I mean, talk about a weird thing. So here she's going to the church in my town, okay, and she's not from around here, okay, and she's telling him what I always called the Virgin Carol story, about she'd never had sex with anyone until she met me, and I'd taught her everything, and you know, and now that I was abusing her and destroying our marriage, that she just couldn't stay with me, you know. And that was just so far from the truth, because she was one of the Stockton girls. And that's what I told him. And after he told me that story about how, your wife loves you, she's never been with any other man, I'm like, I'm sorry, but you've been extremely lied to. And he's like, no, Reed, she's telling the truth. She's never been with anybody else. She wouldn't lie to me like that. And I'm like, yeah, she's lied to you completely and totally. And I went to him to have him help me do an intervention, because he was the last resort. I'd already been to the doctor, and because she held a job, we couldn't legally do an intervention here in the state of California to try and get her into the psych ward, and get started, because I didn't want to put her in jail, because she was my wife, but I didn't mind putting her into a psych ward where she'd get the kind of help that she needed, being that she was molested as a kid. And so, yeah, it was really psycho. I go to this pastor, and he's just totally against me, thinking I'm this wife-beater dude. And I'm telling him, look, I need to gather all of her friends, at least 3 or 4 friends from here at this church together, along with her sister, and our daughter, and her niece, and her mom. And we got to do everything we can to get her in to the doctor. And he's sitting there waiting for her already, And he looks at me and he goes, no, Reed, that's not the problem. You did something terrible to your wife, and you're not man enough to admit it. You don't deserve to have a Christian wife like Carol. And I'm just sitting there stunned, because here I'm going to this man for help, and all he's doing is beating me down. And this guy was the worst counselor. And this is what I'm saying: when you go to a church for counseling, you need to understand you need to not go to any church for any counseling unless there is a licensed counselor, psychiatrist, or psychologist in that church that you can go to. If you want to go to the pastor, all he's going to do is beat you down. This is how it is. This is how all the pastors are that I ended up going to, for the most part, except one. And I say Pastor Stan Kuhn. He was the best pastor I ever had. So anyway, here this guy's, he tells me that, and you did something terrible to your wife, and you don't, deserve to have Carol as a wife. You don't deserve to have a Christian wife. He slams his fist down on the table, because this guy had a serious attitude problem, which is probably why she wanted me to go to him for anger management, because she knew that I would, never be able to do nothing with this guy, because he just beat the crap out of me, And this is a pastor I'm talking about. So he slams his fist down on the table, and he turns beet red. He slams out of his own office and slams the door behind him and leaves me in there. So I'm like, what's your problem, dude? And he's just like, just get out of here. I know you did something to your wife, and you're not mad enough to say what you did. You don't deserve to be a husband. You don't deserve to live. And he's just going off on me big time. And here I'd gone in there basically almost in tears, trying to get help, because I'd already been to the doctor, and he'd already said we can't do an intervention because she has a job. I'd already been to the sheriff's office, and they'd told me the same thing, because here in the state of California, she holds a job. It's not against the law to be mentally ill in the state of California, is what the sheriff's office had said to me. And I'd gone to her parents, and I told them the story, that she'd been molested, and this is what we need to do. I need your help. And they're like, oh, no, that's not what's wrong. And they just want to totally hide what had happened to their daughter and pretend like it didn't happen at all. And I'm telling them exactly what's going on and why she's running now at this time of stage in her life, in every detail that I went through in all these DVDs that I've made before. I told them in every single detail, and they wouldn't believe me. It's not that they wouldn't believe me. They didn't want to believe me. They didn't want to believe that their daughter had been molested. And they weren't willing to admit it to anybody, that she had a mental disability, even though her older brother was schizophrenic and, had committed suicide years before. Okay? I mean, there was serious mental illness in that family that went back generations, and they didn't want to admit that she had a mental disability too, or that she was molested as a kid and now a full-blown child molester. And that's why we're getting divorced. So when I just kind of got, every place I went, I got turned down. Was it the sheriff's office fault that they couldn't do an intervention? No, it wasn't, because legally she had a job and their hands were tied. Was it the doctor's fault? Same thing. That's what he said. He said, there's nothing I can do. So it was my daughter and I. And we're doing our best to try and get all of her friends together, and get this group going. And this pastor, this jerk pastor, he'd gotten this lady in to go counsel my wife, who had been beaten, as a lady herself, and she was advising my wife to divorce me instead of advising her to get help. And she had no business being in there in any part of the counseling, because she didn't know she was dealing with, number one, a worst case scenario manic depressive, or number two, a full-blown female child molester that was doing everything she could to destroy her marriage, molest her kids, and get custody of her son at that time so she could have her way with him. So yeah, when she went out, she went out hardcore. And so, after I got done talking to the pastor, I came home. My daughter was here because she is in tears, my son's in tears, and I'm in tears, and we're all trying to do everything we can to get my wife in for help now that she's gone. We can't leave her out there alone at these different places without telling the people that she's with that she can't be left alone around children. So we're kind of sitting here with our arms tied, waiting to see what's going to unfold next, what's going to happen now. Okay, so I sent my daughter down to this lady's house. Her name was Nancy, and she was the one, she had my wife staying in her mom's house, to try and talk to Nancy and have her help us, get my wife into the doctor, because her hormones had gone totally out of balance. She needs to go in and get her hormone levels adjusted, number one, and she needed some serious psychiatric help, And so this lady, Nancy, she sits my daughter down in her house, and she goes, "Listen, Amarina, there's things you don't know about your dad. Your mom has no choice but to leave him now because he's been beating her." And my daughter just goes off. She's like, "What? You don't even know my dad. You don't know what you're talking about. We're trying to come in here and ask you for help." And she's like, "No, Amarina, that's not true. Your dad has been beating your mom." And my daughter just breaks down in tears in her house, is what she told me, And she comes home here, and she starts screaming, just, "Oh, I can't believe it. I hate that bitch. That fucking bitch. You know what she said about you? She said you were beating her. She said that she's counseling mom to divorce you because you're beating her." So this is the kind of help that I got when I went to the church. Okay? They didn't try and do what a church is supposed to do, which is bring marriages back together. They did everything they possibly could to destroy ours and take it apart. By bad counseling. Bad counseling. And that's what happened. So I went in, after he told me that and told me I wasn't, didn't deserve to have a Christian wife, and that I was lying, what's a guy going to do? Well, he's going to contact the deacons of that church and haul that pastor in front of all those deacons. And that's what I did. I hauled him in front of his deacons, and I told them the truth, and I told all those deacons the truth about what was going on with my wife, about what she was doing, about that she was a manic depressive. And right now, at this point in life, that I'd already been told that she's going to leave between the ages of 46 and 48. And I told him she'd been molested as a child. So the strangest thing happens, man. I mean, I'm in there telling him about my wife, that she was molested as a kid, and how she hated sex. She never wanted to have sex, and that every time I tried to approach her, and I was going to go into that story, and then this 70-year-old man, one of the deacons, one of the oldest deacons there, steps in and goes, "Every time you try and go near her, she starts screaming. And she'd turn around, and pretend that you weren't there, and just tell you no." And I'm like, "Yeah, exactly." And he starts breaking down in tears, this guy. And so I go ahead and continue, and I'm watching this guy, and he clues in every now and again and backs me up on everything, And here, God had put me into his place so he could find out what was going on with his ex-wife, because she had done the same thing to him over 40 years earlier. It was such a blessing to go in that pastor's house with all of his deacons surrounding him, while he was going to try and, say I was lying, and be backed up by most of the deacons. I mean, all of them that I know, because one of them had gone to high school with my dad, and this pastor didn't know this. He was from Southern California or something, you know. So, I mean, here I was surrounded by people that, were locals, that had known my family, that I'd known their family for generations. And, that I told him, I said, and so the Jay, he's in there with me too, the counselor, and he goes, no, there's been some real bad things said to Reed that have really, really affected him bad and have really hampered his recovery from what's going on here. And they're like, well, what happened? So that's when I turned around and I told him what the pastor had said, about how I didn't deserve to have a Christian wife. I wasn't man enough to, stand up and say what I had done, And then the pastor looked at me and he screams, I did not say that. That's a lie. And I looked at him and I said, I forgive you, but it's not a lie. And they're all looking at him. And the one guy who'd gone to high school, my dad, just looks at me, then looks at him and starts shaking his head. And is like, I can't believe you said that to him. And after I left, I guess they kind of got on him big time. And, he was on shallow ground there for a while because of the way he treated me, when I'd gone there for help. And it was pretty hardcore. So, and she did everything she could to try and destroy me. But because I've got this good reputation here, because I had all these witnesses from everything that she'd been doing this whole time, I'd already had the story with the sheriff's office. I had the sheriff's office backing me up. When I told them about the child molestation with Jared and what she was doing there, I told the pastor, and he was just like, there's no way, she would never do that. The sheriff's officer that headed up that investigation also went to that church, so he called in that sheriff's officer, and I gave him permission to, tell him everything. And he backed me up 100%, and that's when he found out and started realizing that the stories that my wife was telling were completely and totally untrue. That I wasn't this terrible wife beater that she tried to make me out to be, for 2 years before she actually left. And that's what I asked him in front of the deacons, when they go, she'd been calling us for 2 years saying you're abusing, and I'm like, most of you know me in this room. If she'd been calling this place for 2 years, well, it turned out the deacons didn't know the first thing about it. It was only the pastor had been getting the phone calls. And I was like, why didn't she call me? I mean, I could have got her into the psychiatrist maybe a couple of years ago. It would never gone this far. And he said, because I didn't remember who you were. I thought the way she described you, I thought you were somebody else. And when you came walking through that door and I saw it was you, he didn't know what to do. And he was lost because now, he's seeing this local, a well-known local that he's seen, for the last 20, 30 years walking into his church, where I hadn't been able to go to that church because of my hours, because I was going to another church also, at times here and there when I went to church. I'm a gold miner too, so I'm out there in the woods and I'm doing my thing in the woods and I'm just enjoying life and living for the Lord completely and totally anyway in my life. Doing the things He's asking me to. When I'm going to be going to the Guardian Angel series, and like I told you, things I do is just incredible. Because I walk that path, the path that I've been on. I perform miracles, and this is just how it is. And I don't need to go to church to prove that to anybody. I have my witnesses, I have my friends, and it only takes 2 people, or more, to have a church. And I'm always out in the woods with at least 2 people. And there's many times we sat in the circles there, down there at my mining claim, having prayer on Sundays, man, because I associate with a lot of good people. And his pastor had no idea about that, and he started finding out the hard way that I was going to different churches, and I had a real wide array of friends, in all areas, but just not in his church, because I had no respect for him because I'd seen the way he treated other people, and I'd pretty much just stayed away. So after that blow up, and, I told him I forgive him, then later on he called me in, and he had completely and totally apologized and said he had no idea what he was doing, and that she'd had him so convinced that I was a wife beater that he just wanted to kill me. He said, He goes, he said he was just waiting for that one thing that I was going to say wrong to go ahead and just call the police and have me put away. You know, and that's what I said. I said I thanked him, man, because, you know, he was willing to do whatever it took to protect my wife, even if it was from me. You know, when he started finding out the truth, and in the end, he ended up finding out about the child molestation. He couldn't believe the story that I was telling. He just couldn't. He couldn't even fathom it. And in fact, the one thing he said to me was, "How can a woman molest a kid? There's just no way. They're not physically able to molest a kid." And I didn't bother telling him the story that you just had on here. And you know, if I decide to show him this, then he'll learn then. But you know, here's a guy who's led a pretty good life, and he has no reason to watch this DVD. You know. I forgave him. He you know, told me he was sorry completely and totally, in tears. In fact, he went and held my hand when she divorced me at the divorce court, because all the way up to that point, she'd told him that I was divorcing her. So when I went ahead and stood up in court with my son and the counselor and the pastor, you know, there with me, and I said, you know, I want no part of this. You know, this is none of my doing. And the judge looked at me and said, okay, Mr. Lukens, that's great. That sounds really good. And she looked at my ex-wife, you know, and goes, how do you feel about this, Mrs. Lukens? And she said, I want a divorce. And, you know, the pastor just was like stunned. And because I completely and totally embarrassed my wife in front of everybody that she knew and came out and told the truth, she no longer looked innocent in the eyes of the church. And I was invited back to that church to become a member. And she ran in terror, not only from me and my son, but from her own church and her entire community. You know, she ran out of this town in shame, with her tail between her legs. You know, and still most of this town doesn't know this story that I've told on here, which was the truth. You know, in every part, in every detail that I can remember. You know, so. And that was that, and that's the end of that part of the story. The only problem I had, other than, you know, the pastors, I ended up, you know, Pastor Stan, he retired from that church, the Colfax Assembly of God, so we got a new pastor. And it ended up turning out that he just happened to move in on the same property as my ex-wife was now living. And so he's hearing all the horror stories from her again. And, you know, I don't go to that church anymore because I have no respect for that guy either. You know, I mean, not that I'm the greatest Christian in the world. I'm just good people. I don't need to go to church to prove that I'm a good person. This is how it is. I do go to church. But I go to churches where they fill me. Because with the things that I do, the things that I deal with, when I go in there, I'm not going to the gas station. I'm going there to get filled up with the Spirit, man, so I can go out there and perform what I do. And perform my miracles and walk with the Lord the way I do. And so he wants me to come down and go to counseling because I'd put out another testimony DVD, a real broken testimony DVD about what had happened, you know, and about how much I love my wife and this and that. And I'd gone into church and handed out the copies, and he invited me down to his house for counseling. And I didn't know that this is the house that my wife was living at too. And he didn't know that she was my ex-wife. And so I went down there the night before, or the day before, somewhere in there, it was the day before, to make sure I could find a place. And I went ahead and, as I was pulling in, it just happened to be the same house that my son had described to me. You know, and let's go into that real quick. When my wife moved out, she moved into an apartment, and my kids went over there and ascertained that it was safe, that there were no other kids around. And what had happened was, she told me she had a 2-bedroom apartment, and that she was going to go ahead and she had a bedroom made up for Abraham so he could come over there on the weekends and spend weekends with her. And I told her, okay, that's fine, that sounds good to me. I just want to go ahead and put a lock on the door, you know, like Steve did with his ex-wife, or with his wife, I mean, and so that my son would be safe, and I know he would be safe when he was there. He could lock himself in, and she would have no way of getting into him. And my daughter went over there and then came back and reported to me and said, "No, Dad, she's got one bedroom and she's got it all fixed up with a double bed for the both of them." And so that, that pretty much killed that part with my wife. And so what happened was she ended up moving out of that place and moving down to this other place. And without even being told, my son went down there and ascertained the entire household that my wife was now in. And he came back and he goes, "Dad, Mom moved." And I'm like, "Really?" And I go, "Is she safe?" And he goes, "Yeah, I went down there and checked it out. There's no kid underneath the age of 16 in that house. There's no babies in there. There's nothing we have to worry about." And I was like, "Dude, you're so awesome. I love my kids, man." And when you train your kids to watch out for their mom to the extreme, and they do it on their own, boy, I'm telling you, that's something to be proud of, man. It really is. I was so proud of him when he told me that, man. I really was. Here's a kid who has been through hell to protect his mom in this house. And he knows that she will never be able to look at me or speak to me again, ever. And this is something that you guys need to understand, When your kids can take care of their mom like this after they've left their husbands and destroyed their marriage and done their best to destroy the credibility of their husbands, okay, after they destroy the credibility of their husbands, depending on where they're living at and so on and so forth, because everything has gone wrong in his life, the husband kills himself every single time. Okay, their life's in ruins. They've been labeled a wife beater. Everybody frowns at him when they walk by and look, and people were frowning at me, and I was just like, Abraham and I look at each other and go, "What was that all about?" And we had no idea until after we went to the church and found out that she'd been talking bad about me for 2 years, trying to do everything she could to destroy my life. So I went through all that too, but because that psychiatrist had told me that many years ago, like I went into it in one of the other DVDs, and told me that I was going to kill myself, I didn't do it, and I never let anybody that I didn't know that was frowning at me get to me, because they weren't friends of mine. They didn't know me anyway. They didn't know what we'd gone through. So yeah, man, I was so proud of him when he did that, because their mom only has the kids now. She'll never see me again. Is this my choice? No, this is because of what I learned in that pastor's house that day with all those deacons and that 70-year-old man who had the same thing happen to him, and he told me what was going on, and the thing was, it was such a blessing to be in that house for him, because he didn't realize that his wife had bipolar disorder, until after I talked to him, until after his daughter had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He didn't know that his wife ran from him, labeling him to be the wife beater 40 years before, because she was molested as a child, until I walked in there and held his hand that day in tears. And I told him his own wife's history. And he couldn't believe it till, and then he started telling me the rest of what I didn't know. He goes, "She's never been able to speak to me, or talk to me, or look at me, or even be in the same room with me ever since that day that she left." And he's just breaking down in tears because he loves his wife so much. And he didn't know until that day, 40 years later, the reason why she couldn't look at him, because she had put him in the same place that my ex-wife had put me. We were the abusers. We were the people that molested her in their minds back between the ages of 9 and 11. Is this just crazy? you know what? I mean, there's really, what more can I say? I've said so much. You guys know everything, and I mean, and this is what I was saying about this pastor now. We're friends now. Oh, I never finished about the other pastor. And so I go down there, and Abraham, he goes down to the house and ascertains the house is safe, right? And he comes back, and he describes the house to me and tells me where it's at. So when I go driving down there, and I realize it's this Spanish-style house, and there's not that many Spanish-style houses in this area, I went back home after I'd gone down there, and I called the pastor and goes, is that the house where my wife lives at, my ex-wife? And he describes, he goes, no, I don't know anybody like that, and I go, she drives a little, green-colored car and so on and so forth, her name and, is Carol and this and that and this and that, and he goes, that's your wife? And I'm like, I guess it is. I mean, and I go, I guess we ought to have that meeting somewhere else, And he's like, okay, well, let me give you a call back, So he hangs up the phone and goes in there and finds out that, this is exactly what's going on. And he'd only heard the horror stories from her about how I was abusing her and all this stuff, and he didn't know the first thing about the child molestation. So I get a call back from my very own pastor. If you ever come down here again, we will kill you. This guy that owns this property, he's a retired Marine Corps, vet, and he's going to shoot you if you try and come on his property. You're going to be a dead man. And I'm sitting there in my house right here in tears, just like, here we go again. What did I do to deserve this? I said, so I go to him, I go, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll get in my car, I'll come down there right now, I'll stand on the edge of the line, you guys go ahead and just finish it and get it over with, I'm done. Just go ahead and shoot me. Then I said, and I go, and this is what it's going to be like. When you have some, the rest of the church come over there to help you do your garden and flowers and stuff, when you invite everybody over there, it'll be, everybody come ahead and come on over to our house except for Reed. He can't come over here because we'll kill him if he tries to come on our property. And this is a pastor saying, what kind of fucking pastor says that kind of shit? Pardon my language, but you know what? I don't have any respect for this pastor. And, he lost me when he came to this church as a new pastor. And basically about half of our church walked out because of him and the things that he's done. Wow. So you can see what I went through with pastors. And most pastors aren't like this. But this guy threatened to kill me, again. Right to my face, and I was so beat down that, I was just damn near ready to take my own life at that time again. It was just like, how many times can a person get beaten to death emotionally like this? And here it is, a new pastor, as Pastor Don, and had threatened to kill me, So I went ahead and Jay was still my counselor. I went ahead and went to him and I called him up on the phone, in tears and told him that I just, been threatened with death again, and Pastor Don was going to kill me if I tried to go to his house for counseling the next day, so we had to change the appointment, and Jay went off. He couldn't believe that Pastor Don had threatened to kill me, and it's like, here's this guy from LA who had been all over the world, living on everybody else's money, which is what a lot of pastors do, they sit there and they take your money, so that you can provide for them, and make their way, and they don't have any retirement because they're not smart enough to go ahead and put money away for later on in life. And so here's this guy, he's, I don't know how old he is. He's got to be in his mid-70s. He has no business being a pastor. In the first place, he's just too old. And now he's a new pastor at our church. And he's a beat-down pastor, one that, is always out there, just trying to beat you down. Instead of when you go to church, you want to get filled with the Spirit, and you're going to the gas station when you're going to church. You're going in there and you're filling your tank, You're filling your spiritual tank in the church, because what I do is so extreme, as you guys can tell with these DVDs, that, when I'm going to church, I'm going there to get filled with love, to get that refill of love put back into my soul, and he just doesn't have it, so I don't go to that church anymore because, You know, every time you go there, I just leave feeling as empty or emptier than I walked in there with. You know, and so yeah, not all pastors are like this. I've got a good church I'm going to now. I've been, you know, and that's the thing about churches. There's a lot of really, really good churches with a lot of really, really good pastors. You know, and then every now and again you come across a bummer church or a bad pastor that has no business being in that church. And that's how it was with Pastor Don. He just had no business being in there. So anyway, I went to Jay and told him, and Jay called up Pastor Don and chewed him up one side and down the other. And Pastor Don came back and apologized to me and said, "That's not what I meant to say. I didn't mean to threaten to kill you and this and that." You know, just, you know, I mean, he was a new pastor in my community. You know, from L.A., you know, him and his wife, and it's like, you know, when you beat somebody down like that and threaten to kill them, I mean, are you ever going to gain respect for this person again? And here it's been, I don't know, it's been over a year, you know, 2 years since he threatened to kill me. And, you know, I mean, I forgive him. You know, he did apologize for it. But the problem is the damage was done, and I just can't forget it. I mean, is it because I'm this bad Christian? No. It just means that he seriously crossed the line. I mean, he's the only pastor in my entire life who's ever threatened to kill me. You know, and especially when he was so out of line, he had no idea what was going on in my house. Or that, you know, my ex-wife that was living with him now in his house, you know, needed to be watched. You know, when I ended up telling him about the child molestation, this and that, he went ahead and took it from there and made sure that she will never, ever be in the nursery at her new church. You know. And that's one thing I forgot to mention is that as soon as she moved out of here, you know, she went to better herself. And what does a child molester do when they're finally tasting freedom for the first time in 25 years? You know, they want to be able to go ahead and they want to be with the kids. She went down and she applied at Colfax Elementary School and tried to get on there. And, you know, I found out through the grapevine that she did this, that she was trying to get on at the grammar school. And that's when I went to the sheriff's office and filed this entire story that I've just told you with them, so it's on file against her. And I also did it for my daughter, you know. It was for her, and I did it all for her so that if someday she decides she wants to press charges for her mom, if that's the way we can get her in to get her the help, you know, if she decides to do this, everything's already on file with the sheriff's office, you know, for my daughter, you know. And I mean, I was so broken, there was no way I could let my wife get on at a grammar school. There's just no way, because, you know, I'd caught her more than once, you know, with little kids saying the wrong things. Only one time it ever went that far to where she's going to actually put her hand down her pants, and that was in that preschool. But there was other kids that I actually went to their parents and said, you know, my wife's getting a little bit too friendly with your kids, and you need to watch out. It's not healthy for your own children when they're seeing somebody else, you know, that wants to give them more love than you do. And we're talking about good loving parents that were there for their kids, but they just weren't realizing that my wife, with her, you know, charming, loving personality, was weeding her way into their kids. And I wasn't going to go out and tell them exactly what it was that she was doing and why she was doing it, and that sooner or later she's going to single them out and they're not going to be seeing their kid. It'll be in the bathroom with her, you know, and she'll be in there finger banging him or something, you know, because she always went after little girls, you know. And the thing was, the girls were young enough that they couldn't speak yet, you know, which is, I think, one of the reasons that a lot of the female child molesters that get away with what they do is because they're going after young girls who are so young that they can't even talk yet. I mean, they can, you know how a 2.5, 3-year-old is. They can, you know, they can speak kind of, but what are they going to say when they don't even know the words to say that, you know, this lady just put her fingers in my vagina? You know, no child's going to know those words, and they shouldn't, you know. So, yeah, I ended up abandoning that church, you know, my church in Colfax that I went to for so many years. And we had great pastors there. We had, you know, Pastor Stan Kuhn, he was there, and then Pastor Ken, you know, that came in as interim. And, you know, Every time you left the church, when they were there, you left filled and ready to go out and battle Satan on his own grounds again for another week. Pastor Don came in. I went there a number of times and never got filled. You know, whenever he was there. In fact, there was times that he was in there, and one time I'd gone in there and I put $75 into the kitty. You know, and the next week I go in there and he's bitching about the amount of money that we gave him, and he goes, "There was only $150 in the pot last week, and that's not enough to even pay my bills or even feed me. You know, and if you guys can't pay more money, this church is going to close." And you know, and here I'd put half that money in that he was talking about myself, and there was probably 30 people in that church or more, you know, that day. And you know, a lot of them are on welfare, can't afford to give more than $1 or $2 or $4, you know, something like that. And here he is. I've been one of the mainstays. Another lady had been one of the mainstays. A few other guys, you know, that were really part of the mainstays of that church that kept it financially going. They left, just like I did, because they all got tired of hearing about him bitching for money, you know. And so now the church is still moving. It's still hopefully going in the right direction. He's lost so many people, you know. It's just crazy. It's just crazy, you know. And actually, a lot of us went back for a funeral here a few months ago, and it was just packed with all of the old timers that have been going to that church for years that had quit. And he's like, "Man, I sure wish you guys would come back to this church now." And you know. And all I could think of was like, yeah, for money, you know, you selfish jerk, you know. So, anyway, you know, you're not going to get that kind of experience at all churches. I just happened to get, you know, a couple churches that had pastors that were immature, that really didn't have any business. And this is why I said in my other DVDs that you don't want to go to a church for counseling, okay? They don't have the experience, they don't have the training, and a lot of the churches, a lot of the pastors have been trained by other pastors to just push you away, okay? If you have a church where you have a licensed psychiatrist, or, you know, a licensed psychologist, or a licensed Christian counselor, it's going to be okay. I mean, the counselor I went to was a Christian counselor here at my local church in Alta. You know, and he was a fairly good counselor, you know, for the most part. I didn't know he was molested as a kid. He made some serious mistakes. But the fact is he still did his best, even though he totally blew it by not calling the police. He thought he was doing the right thing, and because he'd been molested as a kid himself, he couldn't see what had happened. And let's go into that real quick. And then we're just going to go ahead and close this off. What had happened was his mom had set him up with her boyfriend, you know, and given Jay to her boyfriend, and the guy homosexually raped this kid for years. And here he's in his 60s now. He'd been married for 35, 40 years. His wife was pretty frail, and she was in pretty bad shape. Jay's wife, and here I'd lost my wife, and he helped bring me back and kept me and brought me back from the verge of suicide and kept me alive. And so I knew what it was going to be like losing my spouse, because I lost it firsthand the worst way you possibly can, to mental illness, you know, which is what they say is the worst way you can lose your spouse. You know, when your wife runs in terror from you, you know, because of mental illness, and everybody around you doesn't understand and just takes the wrong path, generally the guy kills himself, the husband kills himself. And I had so much else happen to me at that same time. I ended up losing one of my best friends on January 1st, 2006. He called me at midnight, you know, here it was at New Year's Eve, and he called me up, and, you know, I got the call about 10:45 at night from him in the hospital. And he was in intensive care, and he called me and told me he was on his deathbed and he was going to pass away. And he asked me to take care of his wife, you know, get the paperwork straightened out and help her through the transition. I said, okay, yeah, sure, no problem, you know. and his name was Wally. You know, good people. Um, and then I told him to be sure and go ahead and get a will, and go ahead and get the transfer papers done for our mining claim that we had together, and I'd go ahead and buy their half off of her. And he never had a chance. 4 hours later, you know, at 4 o'clock in the morning, he passed away on January 1st, New Year's Eve, you know, 2006. And, you know, and that just started my downfall right there. It wasn't just because I lost my wife, you know, because there it was in January I lost him. In February was when she started trying to sleep with Abraham, and you know, she ended up running out of the house and going out and committing adultery and all this stuff. In March, where I worked at my job, they'd taken me out of our position as the chief gardener. You know, where I'd been a boiler engineer before, I'd gone out and become a gardener for a lot less pay. You know, but so I could still stay there and work the 62 hours I needed to be there during the daytime to pick up my son after school, because my wife really hadn't been around for him for a year at that time. All of 2005, every weekend he was with me. You know, I picked him up from school every day. You know, for the most part, she chimed in here and there, and she would take him to school. And then here it was in 2006. They took me out of my chief gardening job, and the pipes had frozen over the winter, you know, for all the gardens. We're talking, you know, 20 acres of gardens. And now they're all dying, you know. And I'm sitting there watching my gardens die, and so was their 2 guys that were with me. And that's how that started out in March. And finally comes towards the end of May, it was the last point to where everything was dying around us. And all the other employees at the plant were finally getting really pissed off, and they're starting to go to the management and, you know, saying, hey, you need to get Reed back out here so we can go ahead and get these pipes fixed and get things running again. And I'd gone to my doctor, you know, in complete and total stress, because here my wife's trying to molest my son. You know, I've already been taken out of my job, you know, and now I'm watching all my plants die. My rose gardens are just nothing but, you know, a barren wasteland, you know. And I had him take me out of work for 2 weeks, you know, because in that 2 weeks, and this is in May, the first couple weeks in May here in California, it's really hot. And I knew in that 2 weeks that while I was gone, everything would finish dying. All my plants would be finished dying when I got back. Everything would be dead, and I wouldn't have to sit there and watch everything die. Okay. And so the second day into the 2 weeks, my best friend, the same guy from Arkansas, calls me up, and he goes, did you hear what happened to Linda? And Linda was Wally's wife. The lady I'd been taken care of and doing all the paperwork with, and we had all the paperwork done, and I was just waiting for the paperwork in the mail to go ahead and transfer the claim, you know, to me, and I'd already sent her the $5,000, you know, the $2,500 for the claim, and another $2,500 just to keep her, you know, above board, because she, you know, she didn't have a whole lot of money, and I was going to go ahead and do what I had to support her, you know, until she got on her feet, you know, without any problem. And Steve called me up and said, did you hear what happened to Linda? And I said, no, what happened? He goes, she burned to death in her house last night. And here I was already out on leave for stress because, you know, of what I already said. And finding out that one of my best friend's wives, the lady I'd been taking care of for the last 5 months, just burned to death in her house. It just threw me into a spiral, you know, completely and totally downwards. And, you know, it's pretty serious. I mean, so yeah, I had so much happen to me in that year, 2006, that there's no reasons for me to be alive, you know. And then after she passed away, Wally's brother started calling me up and threatening me because he wanted all the money from the estate. But Wally wasn't the one that died last. She did, because they didn't have a will. You know, it went to her sister. So here this guy has called me up and threatened me, you know, and he's going to come to California and take everything that he wants. And so I let him know through an attorney that unless he can prove that he is, you know, the person that's supposed to get everything, the executor of the will, that he's not going to get anything except for, you know, the law enforcement face to face. And so he backed off immediately and went ahead and contacted Linda's sister, and she got a hold of me, and I got the rest of their estate settled with her sister. And so yeah, it was a pretty stressful year. And then, of course, here I am. I'm on leave for 2 weeks because my plants are dying. When I get back to work, everything is dead. And my 2 partners, that were the other gardeners, and I'd said, look, you're going to have to leave. You can't be here and watch our plants die. It's going to destroy you emotionally. And I said, you can't be here. And they're like, well, we just can't afford to leave. And I'm like, you got to leave. So I come back to work 2 weeks later, and here I am, out in my office with these other 2 guys who are just crying their eyes out. Everything's dead, Reed. It's all dead. And I'm like, yeah, I know. And they're like, no, you don't understand. We had to sit here and watch everything die right before our eyes. And here's Archie just crying his eyes out, man. It's all dead, Reed. Everything that we've worked for the last 5 years is dead. And it destroyed him, man. And it was a terrible thing to watch. In July, year 2 months later, Archie was so broken and just so crushed, having to watch our gardens die and everything that was going on, that he just went home and he died. And he was 53 years old. He was just heartbroken. And he was my best friend, and he passed away, and that just broke me. And I was so broken. I knew I couldn't drive to his funeral, and I was still married. My wife had kind of come back, even though she wasn't speaking to me, and she was still being the bitch that she normally was. And I said, look, I need you to take me to Archie's funeral. I can't drive myself. I said, I wouldn't be able to drive home, And, of course, she's, being who she was, said no. So I went ahead and offered to pay her. I said, look, I'll give you $300. Just take me to his funeral. And she's like, I can't do that. I can't go ahead and call in sick to McDonald's and let them know that I'm not going to come in. It's too valuable of a job, her minimum wage job that she had, And so I ended up not going to Archie's funeral. And then Steve, the other guy who was in there crying and the same thing, I ended up, dealing with him too, and we're just kind of trying to lift each other up and keep each other going. And he went ahead and quit that job after Archie died because he couldn't handle it anymore, and then I went ahead and I told him that we're getting divorced, my wife and I, and what had been going on, because they'd been hearing it, because they're the people that I confided in, my 2 best friends, And when I told him that day that, we're getting divorced, he went home that night and had a stroke. So, yeah, I was just, like I said, I've had the gun in my hand in every position that you can possibly think of. Because after that, I went ahead and I took a bunch of pills on accident and, accidentally overdosed on prednisone instead of taking 20 milligrams which is what I thought I heard the doctor say. I heard him say take 20, and I took 20 pills, which is 100 milligrams. And I'd had another doctor who had prescribed me 50 milligrams before, and I went out to lunch on 50 milligrams. But the fact that I'd been prescribed 50 before, I saw no reason to not take the 100 like I thought he was saying. And so when I went back in for the refill 3 or 4 days later, because I was out of pills and totally out of my mind, the doctor's like, what happened to all the pills? Because he gave me a prescription that was supposed to last me a month. And I told him I took 20 pills, and I go, I did what you told me to. I took the 20 pills. And he goes, I didn't say take 20 pills. I said take 20 milligrams, and it was written right on the bottle. And I look at the bottle, and he's like, yeah, sure enough, there it was. And I just thought that because the other doctor had said take 50 milligrams, that he'd actually said take 20 pills. And what I ended up doing is putting so much steroids in my body that I actually literally blacked out. I had an actual blackout, where I came home that night after taking the 20 pills, and I'm seeing God, man. I mean, I'm just out to lunch. And I go in my room and I pass out thinking I'm going to die, and that was the last day of my life. And I passed out and woke up to the alarm clock going off at 7 o'clock the next morning, or, 4 o'clock, 4:15, whatever it was, whatever shift I was on. I was on the 6 to 2. I think it was actually on 7 to 3 at that time. So it went off at 6 o'clock in the morning. And the problem was when I woke up, all I could remember for the entire night before was blackness. I actually had a real live blackout from overdosing on this medication. And when I woke up, I had no memory. And so I went back to the doctor, and this is when we found out that I had overdosed myself. And he told me that there's going to be short-term memory loss. It's probably going to last at least 4 to 6 months before I get my memory back from overdosing off this stuff. And of course, my wife had left at that time too, and here I'd lost, 3 of my best friends had died. The one, Linda, had burned to death in the house. Wally had asked me to take care of Linda, and I failed at that. I was just a failure in my own mind all the way around. My wife had left me now, and I was a single parent, an only parent, because she wouldn't even call or talk to her own son or make any plans to even see him. And I'm just a mess, But you know what? Praise the Lord, man. I made it through all that, and I came back, and I'm here today to tell this story, and I hope you guys learned a lot from what I had to say, and the things that some people have to go through in life, to turn it around, and I'm doing fine now. I ended up raising my son from all the way back there in 2006 in February. He was 14 years old when his mom tried to go to bed with him, and I'd raised him the whole year before. So basically, I raised my son on my own for the last 4 years until he turned 18, and decided to go ahead and move out. And that's what he said. He's like, "Well, Dad, I'm 18. I'm going to go ahead and try it on my own." And I'm like, "Okay." And he's out, and now he's living in Texas with his sister, and they're doing good. And it took him a while to get up on top of it, and he did get on top of it, and he's doing fine. And he's come a long way. Both of my kids are doing just fine on their own. And I did the best I could with them, For a while I thought I was a failure as a parent, because of the child molestation and stuff, and having to fight my wife constantly. But when I look back at my life right now, I can just look back and smile, because I made it through hell, man. I mean, I made it through hell. And I'm still alive. And when I told this story about, everybody dying and my wife molesting the kids and all this stuff to a psychiatrist here 2 years ago, when I went in there because of, things that were going on as far as what happened with me and Jay, the counselor, she helped me, the psychiatrist, she helped me understand that Jay had really screwed up by not calling the cops, and that if he would have called the cops then, back in 2002, that nothing would have happened. None of this would have happened all along, My wife would have never been able to molest my daughter. She would have never had the chance to introduce my daughter to Jared, introduce my daughter to Mickey, She would have never had the chance to try and go to sleep, to go to bed with my son, and none of this would have happened. And so if he would have not been molested himself as a kid, things would have been a lot better off. And this is what she said, is this is why you need to go to professional counseling. This is what I'm trying to tell you. Skip the pastors. If you do go to a pastor and he starts beating you down, you got 2 choices. Just punch him in the face, or turn around and walk away. And depending on the circumstances, that's going to be up to you. I'm not recommending you go ahead and punch him in the face. I'm recommending you go ahead and call the cops and put him away. Okay? But, or at least have him taken out of his job. If he does this kind of stuff to you. You might get a good pastor. You might have a good pastor that is a counselor, that is a licensed counselor, that actually does want to help you with compassion and love. And this is what you want to look for in a counselor. They got to have the compassion. They have to have that love in their heart to want to help you. Okay? If a person doesn't have the love, and the brokenness from being broken like I've been and put here on DVD for you guys, they're not going to have the experience to be able to tell you how to get help or what you need to do for yourself. All right, I really hope that this series has opened some eyes into child molestation and how the female child molester works. And like with Mickey, they're always going to have those smiles on their faces. They're always going to be really happy around the children. And you really got to watch out for these child molesters, whether it's a man or a woman. If you're putting your kids in preschool, watch and look at the people that are working there. And the ones that are the kindest, most sweetest people around your kids are the ones that you really want to watch the most. You're going to want to find out about them. You're going to want to find out about their pasts. Maybe you're going to hear nothing but good about these people. And that's fine, but you really want to pay attention to your kids. You want to learn to speak your child's language. You want to be able to look at your kid and know when something's wrong. And this is how it was when I was in a preschool that day with that little 3-year-old girl that my wife was molesting. I looked at that girl and I could see it in her face that she knew what my wife was asking her to do was wrong, but she didn't know how to say yes or no, and she was kind of smiling at my wife, just smiling at my wife for a second. Then she'd look at me and just be like, then she'd smile at my wife, then she'd look at me because she was so torn, this little child, this little 3-year-old that my wife was molesting. She wanted to be happy and smile and keep my wife happy, who was smiling at her and showing her every bit of twisted love that she had. But at the same time, she didn't know what my wife was talking about, And you know what? I'm going to have to let it go at this because I've told you everything I possibly can remember, and anything that I missed is because I've forgotten, because you got to realize a lot of this stuff goes back to 1984, and here it is 2011. I've forgotten a lot, but I've put everything I can remember into this DVD, and I've put it all into here, and I've poured my heart out to you people, and I hope you, oh, hey, yeah, one more thing. I disabled the comments and everything on this because I didn't know how people were going to take it. And because I'm just trying to put this behind me, I told my story to put behind me. This is my last time I'm going to tell this story, which is why I made it and put it on here so that I never have to look forward, to what was going on in my life again. I'm putting all this behind me. But if you guys need help, okay, my comments are disabled, send me a personal message and I'll do what I can to help you in any way I possibly can, even referring you to the right people if you're here in Placer County as far as counseling and stuff, because I know who counsels good and I know who not to go to, in a couple cases. And for the most part, the counselors and psychiatrists you're going to go to, as long as you stick with professionals, you'll be fine. If you're going to a pastor who's beating you down or telling you need to get over it, and deal with it yourself, just walk away from that pastor and tell him he's wrong. And if you want, you can call me and I will go ahead and give me their number and I'll talk to them and let them know what's supposed to be happening and what they're supposed to be doing, because the pastors don't realize the horror stories that some people can be telling them. I mean, there's all kinds of people out there that lose family members or have a child die, but what happens when you have all that put together? When you've got one family member molesting another one, all of your friends die in 1 year, and then you lose a child at the same time. I didn't lose a child myself that year, but I did lose a child years before. Yeah, there's a lot of tough stuff that happens, and the only way to get yourself put back together is with somebody who's there who can give you the hugs. And I still remember to this day going to church there in Colfax just to get a hug and the ladies just swarmed around me, you know, and they hugged me because they could tell just by, I was so broken when I walked in there. I was getting hugs left and right, and it was, you know, from one week to the next when I went to church, I lived and stayed alive because these women were pouring themselves out to me and give me the love that I needed just by giving me hugs, you know, to lift me up and help me make it from one week to the next. Baby steps, one step at a time. And I got recovered, you know. And I've been recovered and doing good for a long time. This is what I want to pass it on to you guys. You know, a hug can be a life-saving tool. A life-saving tool. When somebody comes up to you and, you know, wants to give you a hug, you be sure and give them that hug, heart to heart. You put your arms around them. You pull them in. Just like I described back in my Bipolar Disorder for Spouses. It's so important, you know. You don't know the brokenness of these people that are around you or what they're going through. You know, when they're coming up and you see that look in their face, you know, and you can see the horror or the shadow behind their eyes as they're walking up to you with kind of a sheepish smile on their face. Just go ahead and pull them in close to you. Put your heart to theirs and make their day. God bless you guys.